Well, hello, everyone. My name is Mary Price. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager at the Shingo Institute at Utah State University. Thanks for joining us today. As you may be aware, each month we ask thought leaders from all over the world to contribute an article to the Shingo newsletter. And starting this year, we've asked them to be part of our webinar series, and this is the first in the series. Bruce Hamilton is the president of GBMP. He's been a longtime friend of the Shingo Institute, and he's well known as a thought leader in the lean world. GBMP is a licensed affiliate of the Shingo Institute, and they offer all the Shingo workshops in addition to several of their own. At the end of the presentation today, we will have a short Q&A session. If you have a question you would like to ask Bruce, please use the Q&A feature, which should be located on the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Thank you, Bruce, for being here today with us, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. So yes, and greetings whatever time zone you may be in. Greetings. It's getting close to lunchtime here in Sharon, Massachusetts, snowy Sharon, Massachusetts. So but I'm very happy to be with you today. So I've chosen a topic to talk about. Seek perfection is the flywheel of continuous improvement. For those of you who are familiar with the Shingo model, you'll know that the Shingo model is based upon 10 fundamental principles. And one of those principles is seek perfection. The definition is given here. Perfection is an aspiration not likely to be achieved, but the pursuit of which creates a mindset and culture of continuous improvement. And I'll not continue with the rest of the definition, but there's a very concise definition. The intent of this particular principle, however, is a lot deeper than can be expressed in just a few words. So I've chosen to borrow from a couple of folks who are smarter than me, certainly, in addition to Mr. Shingo and the Shingo Institute. Got a little bit of thinking from Isaac Newton and Jim Collins. I'm going to talk about those today. All right. So we're starting out with this definition, seek perfection, and I want to add a little bit to that. So we say it's an aspiration not likely to be achieved. So I'm borrowing here from an organization called TSSC, wonderful organization that I've had the privilege to work with as a customer, as a project site many years ago. And I'm showing a model here, a vision of the ideal as it was referred to by my teacher, Hajime Oba. As he was saying, it's not what we can do, it's what we should do. So there's an ideal expressed here, both for the customer and also for the employees. A big focus on human development. This particular graphic is not mine. It's borrowed from Toyota Production System Support Center, a wonderful organization. And these arrows indicate some change. So we're starting with the current condition at the bottom. Whatever that current condition is, could be pretty bad, could be pretty good, but there's always an opportunity to be better. So we're aiming for a definition of customer satisfaction. You may recognize some of these things if you're familiar with the Toyota Production System. And then equally important, maybe more important, focus on human development. Creating an environment that's favorable for improvement is a really big deal, which of course is a big part of the Shingo model as well. Many small changes for the better. Okay, that's what this is. Everyone, every minute, every day. That's something that struck me 25 years ago when I first saw that. I said, yeah, that's kind of what we're trying to do here. We aspire to perfection, but ultimately it involves getting a whole lot of people involved. And that's the challenge. So sometimes we can see this ideal, we see it, we say that this is really, really something that we would like to attain, but how do we do this? So now I'm going to turn to Jim Collins, okay, to the flywheel. Okay, so Jim Collins, incredible thinker, and I think this is one of his more important concepts, the idea of the flywheel effect. Basically, that there's no such thing as overnight success, that we work and labor for many years and and try every day. And little by little, we turn this flywheel. We create some change. And then at one point, it's all suddenly perceived to change. We say, here we are. We've created something miraculous. And so I think it's a wonderful idea, this idea of the flywheel. But I'm going to just take with no disrespect to Jim Collins, after 35 years in the business of trying to create change, I'm mindful of the fact that this flywheel, first of all, it's not a perpetual motion machine. You can get it turning, and there's I agree with it, that part of the principle exactly. But then you need to keep it turning. It's not perpetual motion. And so I'm not sure there's ever a point where you break through, where you leave the force of gravity and you can have perpetual motion. I think as leaders for change, we have to be mindful of at all times of this thing, which Mr. Shingo loved to quote, and he would call that. Oh, excuse me, I wanted to borrow from Newton here. I forgot. So this is Newton's first law, and it's about momentum. If your high school science may remind you that in order that this wheel, it's just going to stay in motion. Okay, going to stay in motion, or it may not be in motion at all. But most things are in motion. Question is, the key point here is it'll continue in the same motion unless acted on by an unbalanced force. So the reality is, when we are trying to seek perfection, we're often faced with this effect, the status quo. Somebody's turning the wheel in the opposite direction. We're not inheriting a system where things are static. We're inheriting a system which may be headed exactly in the opposite direction that we would like to achieve. And when we're seeking perfection, we don't give enough attention to what those conditions are. So this is looking at Newton's first law. We have to recognize that unbalanced force, and that unbalanced force is the status quo. All right. And depending upon how quickly that wheel is turning in the opposite direction, or perhaps it's actually turning faster and faster, we have different conditions in order to seek perfection. So I'm going to draw on another of Newton's laws here, the third law, pretty important law. And that is that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Anybody who's involved in change is familiar with this. It's not just in physical science, it's in social science as well. When we try to make change, we try to create big change, we often can get big pushback. So I've created a couple lists here in a force field analysis. And on the left-hand side is accelerators. So I've listed a bunch of them. You could probably list some more. We like to have a burning platform. Like, why are we doing this? Having customers involved and telling us that we need to change, that's important. Hearing from somebody we trust, peer endorsement, having management involved, have employees involved, having time for training and practice, all of those things are moving us forward. If you can imagine, all of those forces are turning the flywheel. We're going to try and get that flywheel turning. And down there in the upper left-hand corner, you may recognize from McGregor, that is X and Y theory. We have the employees who are giving. We want to give back to the world. We have a frame of mind that basically people are good and want to contribute to the world. Okay, that's great. And that's what we're aiming for. But on the other side of the coin here, we have the inhibitors. We have, short-term thinking, which has to do with oftentimes with financial measures. Our solution to problems is just having extra of everything, extra material, extra machine, extra labor. We're not very smart about this whole process. We're ignorant. We don't know what we mean when we talk about continuous improvement and the possibility of perfection. We don't have a context, and we also have biases. We have biases that some people are smarter than others. That's not that people at certain strata in the organization care more than others. We have the theory X. We have the theory of people don't really want to give back. They're selfish. They're just here for themselves. Mr. Shingo wisely pointed out that there's a little bit of both of those in everybody. And it's management's job to accentuate the positive, to bring out the Y part of us. All right. So All of these things, organizational model, even the way your organization is laid out, makes it hard for us to move that needle, to move the status quo. And that's the flywheel. We want to get that flywheel moving so that we are achieving a new status quo. But it is not a matter of starting from zero. There are precious few greenfield sites that I've ever worked in. Most sites that are working in, we have a huge amount of unlearning to do, unlearning. And that's harder, much harder to unlearn a bad golf swing than to learn a good one in the first place. That's a challenge. And why do I choose Newton's third law here? Because if we want to create changes, we have to be thinking in terms of how this idea, if we make a big change, we get a big pushback. If we make a small change, we make it a small pushback. So that's part of that third law. I'd like to turn to two important aspects of Seek Perfection from the Shingo model. There are these things we refer to as behavioral benchmarks. They're aspects to help us better understand how we would approach this idea of seeking perfection. The first one is structure. We approach in a structured way. In other words, you don't go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in a second. You have to decide what to do first, second, and third. And the other is, as we make these changes, recognize that we have these mindsets, and I've just been talking about them. They're paradigms, they're views of the world which have been established over a long period of time, and they're not easy to change. Well, it turns out that the practice of these many small changes every day help to change the mindset as well as the structure. So I have a structure here, and it's based upon that model from TSSC that I showed you earlier, where organizations start out in a condition, let's say, kind of chaotic. And maybe you've known an organization like that. I worked for one like that. Things were hard. Every day there was new surprises, and then there were ones that I knew was going to happen, and they did. So there's a structure, there's a way to go about the process. We need to approach stability first. You can't really standardize unless you have stability. And so as we're approaching perfection, we ought to approach it in a structured way. And this is a science. This is the technical science, the technical side of what you might call continuous improvement. And as we do this, I'm showing it as a stairway because as we do this, what seemed impossible yesterday now seems possible. That we're developing our most valuable resource, our employees. They're taking many small steps. And as they develop, we're developing our organization. So the mindset and the structure are two sides of the same coin. So here's an important part here. Newton's second law says that acceleration is equal to force over mass. In other words, you have a really big flywheel, you're going to have an awful lot of force to turn it. So the flywheel, size of the flywheel has to do with the size of the change that we try to make. It would be better to have many people making small changes. So many small forces making many small changes, very little pushback that way, and you get everybody involved. So Newton's second law is really important. Notice those little red steps I've drawn in there in between the blue. That's many small changes for the better. We learn through practice. We learn by doing, and it's really not practical. There are those odd times where we may have a huge breakthrough, but the reality is that those breakthroughs, just like Jim Collins said, they're part of turning that flywheel a little bit at a time. Then all of a sudden, boom, we have this thing that we think is a breakthrough. The reality is it's many people involved. Many hands make light work, as my mother used to say. So I've got a method here that I think is very valuable. This actually comes from a book called Managerial Engineering by Ryuji Fukuda. It was the very first book published by Productivity, and it has to do with structure and changing minds. It says identify reliable methods. That means let's figure out what that structure is. What are those things that the best companies in the world are doing, and then create an environment where people can actually practice, and then keep everyone practice. These last two things represent 90% of the success to creating, to seeking perfection. It's more or less a management responsibility to create that favorable environment and keep everyone practiced. Those are not so easy. They're not automatic. We don't just start the flywheel and think that somehow or other it keeps spinning. We're working on this every single day. We're changing mindsets in a structured way. So the paradox is that we're seeking perfection, but we're seeking it in very small pieces, very small bits. This is the way the most successful companies seek perfection. So this is kind of my final definition here. This is my view of seeking perfection. And I would like to kind of dwell on one word, the idea of sustain. So if we get this flywheel spinning, and it's spinning at a constant rate, that's essentially saying we're sustaining. Okay, we're not actually improving at all. What we want to do is get that flywheel spinning faster and faster. And when you gain momentum, guess what? You're accelerating. Acceleration is what we need. The reason we need that is the flywheel is not a perpetual motion machine. And if we continue at a steady rate, sooner or later, the forces that are operating against that flywheel begin to overtake it. Maybe some of you have encountered that in your own work. I certainly have. My idea, over the years, I've decided that seeking perfection, as I've said here, is more and more people solving more and more problems faster and faster. The ideal is to get that flywheel spinning as fast as we can and never stop. Or as we say at GBMP, everybody, every day. So that kind of concludes my presentation. I tried to cover a big topic in 20 minutes, and I've come close. And I think I've covered all of Isaac Newton's laws as well. So now I'm happy to open this up to questions. Just want to let you know that GBMP has workshops coming up, Shingo workshops. We love these workshops. I just finished one yesterday. And I've put a couple of them in red because those are ones I'm teaching. So I'm being selfish here. I hope that I'll maybe see some of you at these workshops. We still have open slots for enterprise alignment and build excellence in February coming up. All right. So Mary, I think that we might have some time for questions now, would we?
Perfect. Yes. Thank you so much, Bruce. There's a few questions in the Q&A.
All right.
I wanted to answer a couple of those myself. We are going to share the recording with everybody that is registered for the event. So we'll expect an email later today with that information. We also had a question about the slides. If you want to contact Bruce directly, then he can share those slides with you. We have one question that's in the chat, Bruce. So I'm going to go ahead and read that to you since it is not in the Q&A section.
All right.
They ask, how do we build team resilience while going through organizational change, especially now during a pandemic?
Yeah, so there's no single answer for that, but stress is necessary for change. I've said many times, there's no change without friction. You should anticipate that friction. But I think the most important thing when you're going through this organizational change is to have a clearly defined sense of purpose and have people working to that purpose. The reality is people are pretty resilient. We've been through an awful year. And yet I would say that when I speak to organizations, almost without exception, they say they feel stronger this year than in the past. So I don't think the fact that you're faced with this adversity, that we're all faced with this adversity right now, is something that that actually is pulling people apart. It's actually drawing us together. All right, so let's see. I've got a couple of. I'm not going to mention names. I got one here from Edward. Would you agree that a major inhibitor is an operational budget? Well, yeah. I mean, when people tell me they don't have money or they don't have time, they're really saying, we don't have money for this, or we don't have time for this. We don't really understand yet what the benefit is. So articulating this idea of perfection That's one of the inhibitors, but it's actually, there's something deeper than that. Once organizations have discovered the benefit, they have time. Money is not an object. They realize that when that flywheel is spinning, that it's better for them. But certainly at the beginning, having some proof of concept is very important because yes, it is an inhibitor. It's part of our whole financial model. For example, training is an expense. We develop employees, that's an expense. That doesn't look good on the books. It's really an investment. We're investing in our employees, but it's easier. We can buy a machine and spend $1 million on it, but we don't want to spend any money to train people to operate the machine because that's an expense. One's an asset, the other's an expense. So I would agree, Edward. Yeah, it is. And you need to kind of identify when you're going to be making that expense to be able to articulate the benefit that you're going to get. How do you address apathy from the line workers towards change? This comes from Edward. Okay, you've got a couple Edwards here. Yes, so not knowing about a particular site, I think that apathy is that's this model here. Mr. Shingo said it's management. If workers are apathetic, then management needs to be creating the volition. He said volition is a number one thing for management to do. Show passion yourself. All this discussion I hear about employee engagement. Yes, it's important, but too little discussion about executive engagement. So if the executives, the managers are not involved, don't expect a whole lot of excitement from the employees. They've been down this road before. One of my favorite quotes about continuous improvement comes from I forget the first name, Roger Millikan, from who passed recently, but was they were the first Baldrige Prize winner and still an excellent company. And he was asked about continuous improvement. He said the three biggest obstacles to continuous improvement are top management, middle management, and frontline management. So I think when I see apathy in workers, I need to take a look at the person they're working for. We need to kind of look up the chain. Should we seek perfection or, I'm looking at another one here. There's quite a few questions. Should we seek, this is from Guru, thank you. Should we seek perfection or progress, not perfection? Well, that's a very good question, Guru. And this is why perfection is important. It's the ideal. And this is one of the more challenging aspects of all of the Shingo fundamental principles, is that they are ideals. We don't want to provide wiggle room. It's the fact that we might not seek perfection, as Mr. Oba said, it's what we should do, not what we can do. The minute you start to back off and decide what progress is, you're looking for optimal solutions. And optimal is another word that worries me, because optimal for whom? How do we make that judgment? As I said a couple of minutes ago, what happens when we seek improvement, seek perfection, is that what seemed impossible yesterday suddenly seems possible through our learning. So no, I would say absolutely, we need to kind of enforce the importance of having the ideal. Otherwise, we have a finite type of challenge that we're trying to face. Good question, though. Very good question. Okay, here's from Lutz. In Europe so far, I only met one Japanese company working with these principles, but I may still be fishing in the wrong pond. So Lutz, yeah, it's a good point. I live in the U.S. and I know that a lot of people think that everybody in the U.S. wears a cowboy hat, but I don't. We're quite a diverse group here in the U.S., as are the Japanese, and there are some really excellent Japanese companies, and there's some that are not very good either. So the ideas are not necessarily Japanese. A good deal of them have, starting out with, the industrialization, the second industrial revolution, the turn of the last century. These are ideas that we've been building on for many years. Looking for the best companies does not necessarily mean they're Japanese. I have an absolute admiration for the Toyota production system, for the ideals of the system, but I'm fully aware that Toyota itself struggles to meet these ideals. So there's a difference between what we're able to do and what we should do. Okay, the ideals don't change even if for some reason we're not able to. But I would say let's look up some Shingo Prize winning companies. You got some really good companies over there in Europe, and they would be generally good companies to share with. I hope I'm not missing too many questions here. They're kind of rolling by. Can you restate? Oh, someone has asked me if I could restate the 3 steps for managerial engineering. I wanted to offer that if you were looking at the screen, anyone who would like the notes from this presentation, just send me an email at bhamilton@gbmp.org, and I'd be happy to provide the notes. But Dr. Fukuta's book, Managerial Engineering, said, identify reliable methods, create a favorable environment. We like to call it a culture today, and keep everyone practiced. Turns out for me, that was the hardest thing in the world. We got to whether good times or bad. Okay. Here's another one. What is your best recommendation on establishing a culture of 5S? All right. So the culture that we're talking about, 5S is a means to an end. Expressing an opinion here. It's a very important process. It creates stability, helps us towards standardization. It is not an end in itself. And I think confusing ends with means, and Mr. Shingo said this as well, can kind of get you into a funk where you're just focusing on a tool. So if you establish a culture that's open, where people are with their safety, emotional safety, where people feel supported, where they receive training, then all of those things apply to workplace organization, visual control, setup reduction. You can start listing your tools off. It doesn't really matter. 5S is one that we all know, but the culture doesn't come from the tool per se. It's the tool benefits from having a culture, and you probably have seen cultures where people are told to clean up their area, and they're punished if they don't put things in a place where their supervisor tells them, and all of a sudden they're no longer the agents of change, the objects of change. So if you have bad culture, you can take a wonderful process like 5S and you can just ruin it. Okay. So I would say I don't think there is a culture of 5S. There's a culture in which 5S and other best practices can thrive. So here's a question from Dan. What do you say to people that we believe we've improved enough? Yeah, this is a frustration, major frustration for me. Many times when we get into a process of improvement, there is a burning platform. Maybe we're losing business. Maybe we're bleeding cash. We have all kinds of things we need to change in order to make an improvement, and we band together, and then things get better. Mr. Shingo talked a lot about complacency. That's an enemy. If we become complacent, I think it was Hiroyuki Hirano liked to say, keep this mindset in mind, that the current process is the worst possible. Current system is the worst possible. Even if you've made a lot of improvement, keep reminding yourself that we can always do better. But it is a natural tendency. The flywheel is slowing down. When people said we've improved enough, what that means is we're just going to keep that flywheel going at a constant motion. And let me tell you, that's disrespectful to your employees, because you've said, yeah, we're done with improvement. We don't actually need any more. And what you get from that is less improvement. Here's a question from Kyle. What do you experience as the most common barrier to starting the flywheel moving, and how do you typically overcome that? Kyle, I listed a whole bunch of conditions, and no two organizations are the same. I think I listed, however, for some typical inhibitors, but you need to take a look at the organization, the current state of your organization. For example, an organization that may have invested some time in total quality management back in the 70s or 80s, they're in a different place today than an organization who has done nothing. An organization that kind of has this idea of the customer, the next process is customer, is light years ahead of an organization that's totally siloed. So I think what you need to do is identify those barriers. I drew that that force field analysis as an example. Draw one for yourself. Think about things that are you need to move forward, and then ask yourself the question: what's holding us back? What are the things that are holding us back? I'd like to tell you that there's a miraculous formula, but sorry, no, there isn't. Okay, this is from Syed. During my change experiences as enterprise lean transformation consultant, is that CEOs usually push for big changes. Yeah, absolutely. And I blame consultants for this, and I'm a consultant. And consultants, and this is because consultants will like to tell management what they think. Managers expect, they're expected to have big change. I think I may be wrong about this, but my recollection is that the average tenure of a CEO is 3 years. So he or she does not have a lifetime to be making change, and they're naturally impatient. And so they like huge events. They like the kind of thing where somebody's going to come in and we are just going to whip this place together. Let me just say that's baloney. The flywheel does not change that way. That's what Jim Collins is trying to say. It changes when many, many hands are participating in the process. Okay, Daniel, how do you measure small incremental improvements? Management wants to see results. How do you show that when starting the flywheel very slow at first? Yeah, good question. When I say small improvements, it doesn't necessarily mean they have small effect. But I think it is important, even with small improvements, to be demonstrating. So bringing management, creating your case means promoting and selling. The first job I was ever in was sales promotion. And I like to tell people when I got into operations that I felt like most of my time was promoting. So when something good happens, I like to let people see and let them know, but it is a challenge. But here's the thing. When those small changes begin to multiply very quickly, if the culture is right. If your culture is not right, you can't grow daisies out of a concrete sidewalk. You might get one daisy to grow. But if you provide the right culture, then many daisies grow. And all of those people are making improvements. So that and I think this is an idea, it's a concept which is very hard, I think, for any of us to accept at the beginning. Somehow or other, the accumulation of all those small changes is highly significant. And if you are a change leader, it's your job to sell that idea.
Bruce,
Okay.
I think that's all that we have time for today. Thank you so much. I know there was lots of questions that we didn't get to, but I will go ahead and send those questions to Bruce and he can follow up with you on that. As I
thank
mentioned
you all for your
before,
questions. That was more fun than the presentation.
oh, good. As I mentioned, I'll send out the recording and you can contact Bruce for the slides. And keep your eye open for next month's webinar. We'll put an announcement in the newsletter that goes out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and I hope you have the great rest of your day.
Thank you.